Our question for this evening is a simple one. Where in the Bible do we find church members' meetings? Some people will point to Acts 13, 1-3. We'll read that now and come back to the passage later, but we read that in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who'd been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Some people that think that that's where in the Bible we find the church meeting as a pattern for churches to be governed. But actually it's a bit more complicated than that. If we look in the Bible, we find different patterns for leadership. We find the Jewish patterns. We find that for the Jews in the synagogues, there were the priests and there were the elders, the lay people who ran the synagogue. But in the early church, across Acts and then through the different letters, we find different groups of people. We find the apostles, normally referring to the 11 who had been with Jesus, and then Matthias, the 12th, elected by the others. We find people called overseers. We find other people called elders, and we find other people called deacons. And then in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about 4 groups of people who are God's gift to the church: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the pastor teachers. From these, different churches, different denominations have developed different styles of church government. And of those, by far the most widespread is what we could call episcopal government, government by bishops. The word episkopos, often translated as overseer. The bishops preside over a whole diocese. All the Christians in the diocese are under the one bishop, and then the bishop delegates his authority to local priests who act vicariously on behalf of the church. They are vicars. That's the pattern of Roman Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, Anglicans, and some African American Pentecostals as well favor bishops, episcopal government. When I asked an Anglican to describe how this works for that series we did in Brentwood, the rural dean of Brentwood wrote this about their episcopal government. The local church is understood to be the diocese, that is to say, all the parishes under the oversight of one bishop. In practice, there may be also area bishops assisting. And priests exercise their authority by delegation from the bishop. The church is led by the bishops and governed by synods consisting of elected lay and ordained members. And there are synods at different levels: national, diocesan, deanery, and parish levels. And then locally at parish level, the parochial church council, the PCC, is charged with cooperating with the priest to promote the whole mission and ministry of the church. But in the Episcopal churches, in the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, authority lies with the bishop and is then delegated down to the local churches from him. When they talk about a church, that is for Anglicans the whole diocese of Chelmsford is just one church with all its local parishes underneath it. Historically, episcopal government has been the heart of the church for close on 2,000 years, until the Reformation, when other patterns came in 4 centuries ago. We could talk about congregational government, which is how the Methodists do it. They have circuits of small groups of churches, but their ministers are recognized centrally. We could talk about Presbyterian government in the Presbyterian and the URC churches, where the local elders, presbyteros, the word there, the elders govern the church in relationship with other churches. We could talk about other of the new church movements. The Restorationist churches, New Frontiers and Ichthus would follow that pattern. Other streams, Vineyard and Hillsongs, where a strong central leadership has authority, and then they delegate it to appointed local church leaders. But we're Baptists. We want to think about what it means to be a Baptist church and to be baptized members leading the church in the church meeting. And that's what we call the congregational pattern of government, where each local church is independent and self-governing, and the church members meeting, not the minister or the elders and deacons, has the ultimate authority. And that will be true for Baptists, Congregationalists, and many non-denominational, independent evangelical churches. Congregational government. And this is how the Baptist leader, who turned out to be me, described Baptist church government. Each local Baptist church is self-supported congregation, independent of all others, governed by in all matters of faith and practice by the church meeting, where the members gather together under God to discuss and make decisions. The ordained minister and the lay elders and deacons lead the church, but have no authority over it. In our case, North Springfield Baptist Church relates to others for encouragement and mission through the Eastern Baptist Association and the Baptist Union of Great Britain. But the association and the union have no control or authority over the local churches at all. We don't have bishops or moderators, which Methodists would have. Authority rests within the church, in the church meeting. So we ask ourselves, where do we find congregational government in the Bible? And the answer is more complicated than Baptists would sometimes like to think. We looked at Acts 13, 1-3, this picture of a church being led by prophets and teachers. And while they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." And after they'd fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. The beginning of Paul's missionary journeys. Some people like to describe that as a church meeting, but actually it wasn't all the members voted on this. It's not congregational government. We could best call it charismatic leadership, that it was those gifted with the Holy Spirit in gifts of prophecy and teaching. And in a time of worshipping the Lord and fasting together, they heard the voice of the Holy Spirit guiding what should happen, not the voice of members of the church. So it's not really fair to say that in Antioch, in Acts 13, we have the church members meeting. We could look to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Paul and Barnabas were appointed to go up to Jerusalem on their missionary journeys, coming with questions. They went up to Jerusalem to the leaders of the early church in Jerusalem. And we see in Acts 15, verse 3, that was the apostles and the elders. And when they came to Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders. So the Council of Jerusalem was a group of the apostles, such as were still alive at that time, and elders leading the church in Jerusalem and having some authority over all the churches everywhere, because that's where the church had started from and spread out from. The Council of Jerusalem reported their decision, and they reached a decision on questions which Paul and Barnabas brought them. We read in verse 28 of Acts 15, "It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us." And they sent a letter to all the Gentile churches on behalf of the church in Jerusalem, guiding all other churches, all the Gentile churches that Paul was establishing. And that seemed to rest on the authority of the apostles and of the elders, but it also had the leading of the Holy Spirit. So there was authority coming out of the apostles, delegated down, but also the Holy Spirit was very much involved in guiding there. If we look across to Paul's missionary journey in Lystra, Iconium, Antioch. He traveled through that region. He planted churches. And then we read that Paul and Barnabas, as those who had founded the churches, appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they'd put their trust. So the elders were going to carry on leading the churches on the authority of Paul and Barnabas, who had established the churches. We notice that the elders were appointed by Paul. They weren't chosen by the church. And then we could look at the relationship which Paul had with Timothy, who was the leader of the church at Ephesus. And two passages in 2 Timothy and then 1 Timothy give us an idea of how Timothy got to be leader of the church at Ephesus, where in 2 Timothy 1 verse 6 Paul says, "For this reason I remind you to fan into the flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands." So Timothy was leader of the church at Ephesus because he'd received an empowering through the Holy Spirit when Paul laid his hands on him. In 1 Timothy 4 verse 14, "Do not neglect your gift, which was given you through prophecy when the body of elders laid their hands on you." So again, laying on of hands, again, an empowering of a spiritual gift. We don't know particularly what Timothy's gift was, but an empowering when the body of elders laid their hands on you. This isn't government by church meeting. This is, again, charismatic government and authority being passed on from one leader to another. And so if we look at what the New Testament pattern of leadership is, we would say that it is that the apostles appointed elders in churches, and the elders then went on to appoint their colleagues and their successors. We can also see the feature of the laying on of hands being significant. This usually was associated with the coming of the Holy Spirit, equipping the new leader for their role in leadership. We can also see in there the beginning of the practice of ordination as a sign of the authority of one leader being passed on to another in the laying on of hands. But we have to say that if we're looking for government by church members meeting, where the members of the church choose who will be their leaders, where the members of the church choose who will be their minister, we don't find that in the New Testament in anywhere at all. We find authority being passed on from leader to leader. We find inspiration of the Holy Spirit coming upon the new leaders, and we find authority being transferred through the laying on of hands in the beginnings, although it wasn't called in that time ordination. That word only really began to be used in the 2nd century AD. But we don't find government by church meeting at all. So we have to ask, why congregationalism? Why do Baptists and other free churches prefer to have government by church meeting? It grew up in the 16th, 17th, particularly growing through the 18th, 19th centuries, through a recognition of the primacy of the individual conscience of the believer. The individual believer should be free to be led by their own conscience. They shouldn't be being ordered around by others. The reason why our Baptist forefathers rejected the idea that authority would be passed down and imposed on a church was because of the danger of authoritarian leaders who would take the power and the wealth of the church for themselves, we've seen that problem was part of the reason for the Reformation. That problem is so much a part of the problem for churches around the world, where authoritarian leaders take control of congregations. The dangers, particularly in health, wealth, prosperity, gospel churches. The dangers of authoritarian leaders are protected against by having government by the church meeting and all the members of the church having a voice. And the other obvious reason why that's been adopted by Congregationalists, by Baptists, is because of the failures of particularly Episcopal government in maintaining the doctrine of the church. The early reformers, our Baptist forefathers, the Anabaptists, were very much rejecting the false doctrines as they perceived them of the Roman Catholic Church, and indeed within the Anglican churches as they split away and became the free churches. And seeing that the bishops had not preserved the purity of the church or the doctrinal purity of the church. Our Baptist forefathers and other free churches broke away from that system of having bishops who were entrusted with the doctrine of the church. They said each congregation must be free to understand the scriptures for themselves and not have false understandings imposed upon them. So congregational government grew to protect the church against authoritarian leadership, but also to protect the church against false doctrine. I am a Baptist, I'm a Baptist minister. I am committed to congregational government, but I'd have to say that a lot of the reasons why are not to do with finding congregational government in the New Testament, because we do not find it there. I'm committed to congregational government because I am persuaded that to avoid authoritarian leadership and to avoid false teachings being imposed upon a church from elsewhere, it is better to be governed by all of the members coming to decision under the Holy Spirit in the church meeting. It's not the best form of church government. It's not the only form of church government. But I am persuaded that government by church meeting is the best pattern that we can work with in today's church, in today's world. But before we criticize others, Ruth very wisely once said to me, don't take the bishop out of your brother's eye until you have first taken the church meeting out of your own eye. We must recognize that there are different patterns of church government through history, through the denominations today. We Baptists must not presume that ours is the biblical pattern or the only pattern of church government, because that simply is not the case.